Good morning and welcome to everyone. Please take a seat, get yourself comfortable. Welcome everyone on streaming. We have a very special program today. My name is Bob Smolin. I'm the chair of the Adult Education Committee along with Linda Shanker and Craig Padover, and I'm delighted to invite you to a very special guest today. Many months ago, I thought it would be a good idea to make a connection with in Israel, the Israel Consulate, something that made a stronger Israel connection for our synagogue. And it was much about anti-Semitism as I began to see it on the unrest of the college campuses, and it began to rear its head in a way that I didn't think would ever happen again since my childhood. A lot of things have happened since then, and the timeliness of our speaker makes it even more important than I thought it would be. So I'm delighted that you're here, and let me explain about our format this morning. Our speaker will do a short presentation, and then if you have questions, I'm asking you to come to the microphone. And the reason to come to the microphone is that you can't be heard on streaming if you don't use the microphone. Maybe the room as well, but streaming particularly. That's the reason for the microphone more than not. So let me start with sharing with you a little bit about the organization I connected with. It was the Consulate General of Israel in New York. And if you're not familiar with that, the Consul General of Israel in New York represents the state of Israel in New York, and it represents New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Delaware. The Consulate General of Israel in New York plays a key role in strengthening and deepening the ties between Israel and the U.S. It actively promotes bilateral relations in these states, enriching the unique relationship between the two countries. The consulate's activities include fostering relations with elected officials, engaging different communities, interacting with our civil society, and liaising with local as well as national media. It focuses on enhancing cooperation in the areas of economics, culture, and academia. Moreover, the consulate maintains robust connections with the Jewish communities and various organizations in the region and provides extensive consular services, which many of you may have taken advantage of. Our speaker today is the Consul for Public Diplomacy at the Israeli Consulate in New York, Yuval Donio-Gideon, he'll get the correct pronunciation, Gideon. Since August of 22, just a couple years ago, Yuval serves as the Consul for Public Diplomacy at the Consulate. With a distinguished military career of 6 years in the Israel Defense Forces, as well as holding a BA in psychology, political science, and an MA in political science from the University of Haifa, Yuval began his tenure in the diplomatic cadet course of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel in 2006. The decision to pursue a life of service has led Yuval to some incredible destinations with diverse and important positions. His experiences began in 2007 as the Deputy Ambassador of Israel to Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Burundi, before being assigned to the positions of Deputy Ambassador of Israel in Finland and Estonia in 2008. It gives him certainly connections to Africa and certainly the Eastern European front, especially in Ukraine. In 2013, Yuval returned to headquarters and was critical member of the Congress Relations Department of the North American Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 2016 until 2022, Yuval was the ministry's representative to the Planning Directorate of the IDF. So the background in psychology, political science, IDF, Yuval comes to us with a tremendous amount of background and experience, and he's been in New York since the last 2 years. He will make a short presentation, give you an opportunity for questions. I might ask that you put your phones on silent at this time so his presentation is not interrupted, and that when it's time for questions and answers, if you would come up and use the microphone, please, again, for the purposes of communication, especially for those who are on streaming. So let me welcome to the microphone, Yuval.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy and humbled to share this morning with you, and thank you for enabling me to be part of the adult education that you're maintaining here. As Bob mentioned, I'll speak a little about our activity in the consulate and how it was affected throughout the recent year of the war. And I'll be more than happy to engage with you in any other particular issue that you'll have interest to. So just say a few words more about myself. So although, as Bob mentioned, I've been at the Foreign Ministry almost for 2 decades now. Originally, I was born and raised in the Upper Galilee in the city of Safed in northern Israel, city which is heavily bombarded in recent months. Personally, I have also family both in the north and in the south deeply affected by the war in recent year. My family in the north lived very close to the border with Lebanon, Hezbollah, something like 1,000 feet. So they were displaced immediately in October 8 and stayed displaced since then. It's my sister and her kids and grandkids. And Nice in the south, in the Gaza envelope, that was under siege on October 7 with 3 young kids in the safe room until they were able to fled from the kibbutz, and they were displaced for almost a year as well. Just came back now in the summer. A brother in Beersheba with a son who in a combat unit throughout those months, and now does a reserve service. It's not very different from any Israeli or most Israelis that I know, definitely not from all Israelis around me in the consulate. All of us have family that was in one way or another impacted by what's happened, family or very close friends or both. And that applies for so many people in Israel. Almost all of Israel feels that personally, this war. It's not similar to anything else we've experienced in our lifetime or ever. Not only because the way this war started, also because the impact it has on the Israeli society. Naturally, it impacted a lot our work in the consulate as well. What we've been doing in recent months since could be described in 2 major pillars, almost exclusively. One is broadening and deepening the scope of legitimacy for the IDF to act and to fight. We can touch a bit more about that later on, but you realize that it's been very challenging as months proceeded. Second of all, is the issue of the hostages. Keep it on the agenda. It was easy at the beginning. It's more complicated as we went through. And we had here, I think, over 40 delegations of families of hostages, in addition to hostages that were released or people that survived the massacre. And we tried to maximize the presence here in order to make the case and leave it a vivid thing on the agenda. So 13 months of war, 7 different fronts, as mentioned by others. That includes naturally Gaza and Lebanon, but also Judea and Samaria, which have been very active terror-wise, and we're trying to contain this front. But we also have been fighting militias that's been targeting us from Syria, militias from Iraq, and Houthis from Yemen, and most recently also directly the Iranian front, as you're well aware. And aside from having all this active front, there's also the 8th front, what I call the public sphere. And I do public diplomacy. So me personally and the consulate in New York as a whole is very active in that dimension. And to a great extent, in this war in particular, this front is of extremely important. It applies to all the foreign ministry, but I think in such a central place like New York, and the consulate in New York is very pivotal. It's one of the two biggest missions Israel have in North America, together with Washington, D.C. It bears a lot of responsibility, center of the media, also center of business and culture, and the biggest Jewish concentration outside of Israel. So it bears a lot of responsibility. How does it look? So our work is very diversified. We work vis-a-vis elected officials, we work vis-a-vis the media, we work with civil society, we work with academia and campuses, we work on the cultural front, we work with the Jewish immigration throughout the different states that we're handling. And as I mentioned, a key part of it was also around the hostage delegations and hostage issues, out of which the department I'm heading, the public diplomacy, was focused mostly on the civil society, the academia, and the hostage issues. I'll elaborate a bit how does it look in reality. So elected officials, it's true that the mainstream of the elected officials in all states that we're handling has been very supportive of Israel in one way or another. And speaking about the mainstream, that accounts for, I'd say, easily 80 to 90% of the elected officials, both in the federal level, but also in the state and local level. But it didn't come on its own. It comes through a consistent work, both by the consulate directly, but also by a lot of Jewish congregation throughout. And you've seen some very strong statesmen, both here in New Jersey and in New York, the governor, the mayor of New York, and others, and Congress members throughout the area. So we've been meeting with them, presenting them with materials, keeping the issue relevant for them, corresponding with them. In Washington, D.C., they're also dealing with other aspects of legislation and others. The media, the consulate have held many, I'd say dozens, if not hundreds, of interviews, op-eds, and articles which we've been involved in with the media, both local and statewide media. We've also been very active in the social media. This is the scene today to a great extent, no less than the traditional media. The academia, I personally spoke with over 30 presidents, provosts, deans of major universities in the 5 states that we're handling. A major thing that I've been speaking with them was about anti-Semitism on campus and PDS, but not solely on how do we combat anti-Semitism or how do we treat someone when he's hurting or threatening to hurt someone, because there are rules. There's legislation, state legislation, and there's the federal legislation, and there's the rules of the university. So many times when someone would break the rules, the university would take steps appropriately. But I also spoke with them with something which is way more nuanced, and I think you could bond to that easily. It's that tricky thing of sense of security for the Jewish or Israeli students and or faculty members. How do we keep this sense of security? And how would we do that without harming the sacred First Amendment and the legitimacy of anyone to say anything that he wants? And indeed, I did not, and I do not ask them to forbid anyone from saying anything which is lawful. That's fine. But we also know that people could speak in a lawful way and still create a toxic environment. And I think the First Amendment stand to the university administration and faculty as well. And I asked those presidents and provosts and deans to tell that even if something is not forbidden, it's not constructive, and it's exclusive and intimidate to a particular group, be it Israelis, Jews, or others. And universities in particular are not the places when you want people to limit their self, their opinions, their identity. This is the place for mostly young people to come together, explore, meet other people, and learn. So some of these talks were very useful, and we also saw steps by universities, even by major university from the Ivy League or by state universities and local colleges. Sometimes it was more complicated. We follow up on that. I also visited several of them in person, mostly myself, in some cases also the Consul General, Mr. Ophir Kunis. So there's been that perspective. On the front of the Jewish communities, we hold very close and intense relations with Jewish leaders of major communities, of major organizations, but we also travel a lot. Only this week, been to New Jersey and Ohio, and of course New York communities, and also Philadelphia in recent weeks, trying to be engaged with the communities, stress that we are not alone, but you're not alone. This is something that brings us together. We saw that after October 7, and you're welcome to correct me if you feel differently. Jews close ranks, came closer to each other, gapped their different opinions, and gathered around Israel. Not only that, many of them, in particular those who perceive themselves as liberal or even progressive, found out that their colleagues from yesterday, whom they've been fighting along in the trenches for decades, some of them just evaporated after October 7. They wouldn't return their calls or their emails. And that's the better case. In some cases, they went all out against Israel and Israel's right to defend itself. And many of those individual and or communities felt alone. So not only did they came together and closer to each other, also they strengthened the ties with the official representation of Israel abroad, mostly in our area as the consulate. Civil society, we work a lot, including in recent year with NGO, think tanks, community leader, research centers. And it is an important part of our work because to many, many people, that's the way to reach out. They don't come to conferences, they don't speak with elected officials, not necessarily will they consume the media that we're able to reach out and speak in. So through the civil society, we're spreading this dialogue with many of the communities. We stress a lot working with minority groups. It's a big thing here and especially in New York. But we also stress particular things which are relevant to audiences which are very challenging for Israel throughout periods, but especially in recent years. Progressive audience, minority audience like the Afro-American community, LGBTQ community, and others. We target them specifically and we engage with them to the extent we're able. We also initiated a lot of activity with women leaders and organizations and other surrounding the issue of gender-based crimes that Hamas has committed on October 7th. And this is an issue that was downplayed and silenced by a lot of people at the beginning. It took weeks, not to say months, until it was acknowledged first by officials, later on by the UN, that such thing really happened. And this was one of the dreadful things that happened alongside the murder and the kidnap in October 7th. And so this is an example of another thing that we do. And we also initiated to those audiences within the rest screenings of the IDF Bear Witness testimony movie. It's a 47 minutes movie, not narrated, comprised only from videos that we achieved either from social media, sometimes Hamas social media, either from the body cameras that the terrorists carried with them, or the security camera that was in the different kibbutzim, villages and towns. It's pretty shocking, it's very self-evident, and I didn't see anyone who watched that and stay indifferent. So we initiate a lot of this screening to various audiences in the civil society, in the academy, but also law enforcers, elected officials and others. I already mentioned the many visits of the families of hostages. What we do with them usually, either we create particular events for them. An example was about a month ago or so, we rented a yacht and we did a tour with signs and flags and signs of the hostages in Gaza around Manhattan at the time of the General Assembly, and was also covered in the media and so on. Sometimes it's assisting them to get into the media and expose and amplify the story of their loved one. Sometimes events in Jewish communities, it depends. And lastly, I'll say about the cultural sphere, we used the diverse, strong Israeli culture to amplify what has been done in Israel in that sphere since October 7. It reflects to a great extent, naturally, the Israeli cultural creators have reflected upon the life in Israel and what happened on October 7 and how life looks today. Many of them were nominated for awards and so on, but we also took this stage and amplified the relevance of the war to the cultural sphere. Just to say, on that front of the public diplomacy, it is of extreme importance, all the assistance we have from Israel, many friends, Jewish communities and others throughout the world, in particular here in the US. Each one at the very place that they feel comfortable to portray this support. Could be social media, it could be going out of your comfort zone and speaking to audiences that maybe you reach and we can't reach. It could be speaking to elected officials and let them know what you think. I think that an elected official in any level that will get 10 emails a day for weeks, it's something really hard from his electorate or her electorate, it'd be hard to ignore. Because here's the thing, it's not an Israeli war. It's not even a war of the Jewish people. I really believe it's a war of the free world. We just happen to be in the first row in Israel. And I could tell you that many feel the same. Yes, there's a major challenge and some feel very differently. But it also depends who you choose to engage with. I personally try to devote the limited resources I have and the consulate have not to engage with the Israel haters, because that probably won't lead me to anywhere. Those 10, 12, 15%, which it doesn't matter what I'll say, they'll keep saying that it never happened, or that it's a conspiracy, or Israel did it, or we deserve it, or whatever. I probably won't move the needle over there too much. And if I will, it'd be very minimal with a lot of effort. And then there's the base, which is, it's important to invigorate the base and be together. But most of my resources, I try to aim at these people on the middle ground, which are uneducated about what's happening or couldn't care less or don't want to pay the price of being involved. I try to reach out to those communities and engage with them. I don't expect them to march in the streets with Israeli flags. I mean, it'd be very nice, but probably won't happen. But if they're doing business with Israel, I'd like them to keep doing business with Israel. If they intended to travel to Israel, I want them to keep this travel plan. If they're in the academy and they're engaged with Israel scholars, I don't want them to shy away or boycott them, and so on. And if we get this majority of people, which is 60, 70% of the population, on the right place, the haters will still hate us, but their impact would be marginalized. So that's my advice to you as well, to the extent you're able. Where we're heading from here, so first of all, on the global level, it reflects a power struggle which is way bigger than Israel. It's between civilizations, there's a lot of world politics in it, but also reflects other trends, both in the media and how you treat things that you see, factual-based debate or others. You see that in many areas that has nothing to do with Israel. Look at American politics, international relations and others. But also impact things like anti-Semitism, which I'm sure, regrettably, that many of you have experienced the peak in recent year. I see the ADL shocking data from recent year and been a rise of, they speak about 400% in some areas, shockingly. After many years that we have been seeing increase of 20, 25%, and now it just peaked. And it's not pleasant sometimes to be a Jew, even in the US, a place where the Jewish communities have integrated as no Jewish community ever have integrated. Jewish community in North America is extremely successful, better educated, well off, a part of elites in many ways. But we know that this does not immune the society from anti-Semitism. Some would claim maybe the other way around, I'm not sure. And this is an issue that we address a lot in the consulate, in the foreign ministry. It's also very personal for me. My mom was a Holocaust survivor. My father fled Germany as a kid when the Nazi came to power. So I guess if there was no European anti-Semitism in its form, they would never leave their homes, never come to Israel, and I would never come to be. So if you wish, I'm an outcome of European anti-Semitism. But seriously, it's an issue that has been there already throughout time, but it's way more evident now these days. Where we're heading regionally in the war, we're very consistent. We're trying to be and very serious about achieving the goals that we define. We won't rest before we'll bring back home all the hostages. We are determined to finish, to destroy all the infrastructure of Hamas politically and militarily in Gaza, its ability to govern and recuperate, not only its current abilities. We are determined to push Hezbollah away from the border and enable the tens of thousands of displaced people to come back to their homes in northern Israel safely. And we're determined to stand firmly and not enable any enemy to threat Israeli citizens, regardless if it's close on our borders or remotely from Yemen or Iran. And finally, we're trying to create, and this is naturally not only a military effort, it's a political effort, a diplomatic effort, to create a reality which will be more sustainable and which will not enable what we saw on October 7 to come again. Not enable the vicious circle around us to form this threat again. Because we definitely failed colossally on October 7, but we don't have any intention to enable that to happen again. So I'd like to stop here and invite you to ask me about what I said or anything else that you would like me to talk or react or answer any questions. Just remind you, Bob's request to use the microphone for the people which are online with us.
Thank you, both for what you do and for coming here today and speaking with us. As you said, many of us in the Jewish community here are doing a lot of the things that you're doing. We're helping to defend Israel's actions, and I'm among those, and I find most of it very easy and simple to defend. The one thing that I can't, and maybe you can help me, is there's a small number of Jewish terrorists in the West Bank, and it certainly looks like Israel is pursuing them very, very half-heartedly. And that's very hard to defend. So if you could correct me if I'm wrong, or help me understand how this could be, that would be helpful to me as I speak about Israel's actions.
Thank you. So the thing which I would like to differ a bit is that we're dealing with them half-hearted or not really forcefully. There's, as you probably know, a special unit in the Internal Security Service that deals solely with Jewish extremism and Jewish terror. And there's in the police several units and the district of Judea and Samaria that deals with that. And the IDF is active in that. Now we realize that it is a complex reality and that sometimes it doesn't work the way we think it should appropriate work, and we're trying to do better over there. But overall, when we look at, let's say, close to 2 million Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria, and roughly about 500,000 Jews that are living there, and they're in constant fraction, I think the number of incidents is still humble. I'd like it to be less, and we're active to try and minimize that. But overall, I think that Israel still is and aspires to be a state of law. And when someone is breaking the law or act in ways that endanger the others or harming others, we try to bring them to justice. But that's not always as easy given the circumstances. And also bear in mind that we're doing that while having a forceful war that's going on, as I mentioned, in Seven Front. In countries which are in war, many times tend to be more flexible in the way they enforce the laws. We try badly not to be those countries, but it happened all around. I served in Finland, as mentioned, and we had good relations with the Finns, but sometimes I would have questions about the way that we treat the Palestinians, detainees, or people that we arrest suspicious of terror. I would tell them, of course we should be accountable, and places that we do wrong, we should do better. Do you really want to have a conversation about war ethics? Because the last time you fought someone was in World War II, and about 1/3 of the Russian prisoners of war died in captivity for various reasons. And it's not small numbers. And I think we've seen things like that in other. Finland was a democracy in World War II, and so was the US and Britain and others. That's not an excuse, but it says that things are complicated, especially when you allocate so much to the different fronts. We have hundreds of thousands of people on reserve service. We have police officers that are working 7 days a week for months now. So, and the Internal Security Service is extremely busy, from interrogations of people, terrorists that we arrested, to foil terror attacks in Israel, which, as you see, not only happening on each one that you heard that happened, there's tens that are foiled, and others. And again, we're trying to do better, and we should. That's not an excuse to enable something wrong to happen, but you also have to acknowledge that it's a very complicated and unusual situation. And that overall, the number of incidents, as I mentioned, when you consider the population which are mingled together in this area, is still humble.
Thank you for speaking today. I've been reading a little bit about the gas reserves, Leviathan, and how that's changed the economic situation for Israel and the whole Middle East. And I'm curious to know how you factor all that in with the possibility that Israel's relationship with other Middle East countries could still change, that dynamic could change as a result of this incredible discovery of gas reserves off of the Israel coast.
Thank you. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I was a student in the 90s. And I remember what was referred to the late President Shimon Peres, who used to say in the Middle East, you got two kinds of countries. You have the oily lands and the holy land. You can't have both. So oil we didn't find to a great extent, but gas we did in recent years, as you mentioned. And you can't exaggerate in the importance of it to the strategic relations of Israel. Not only that we're able to supply our own gas needs, and those have been growing substantially since we found the gas, but most of this gas is going to export. Some of it is to our immediate neighbors, like Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, but most of it is aimed at Europe. There's challenges. There are a few techniques. You could liquefy that, and that's what we've been doing with Egypt together. Put down a line that will go either from Cyprus or from Turkey, and we've been exploring. There's political complications and economic considerations to that, but definitely makes a difference. By the way, it makes a difference to our European neighbors, at least the southern part of Europe, which, as you remember, is dealing in recent years with a great challenge because Russia, to some extent, made the availability of gas much smaller. And in Europe, unlike in Israel, in many places, the infrastructure for heating is based on gas. So in the Central and Northern European, if you don't have sufficient gas, that's very bad news for the people. That's strengthening relations between countries. It does substantial economic difference, and there's interdependence, which one could realize that contributing to Israel's resilience as well as to its neighbors. And I think that the gas finding and the gas cooperation have been maybe the first civilian thing that Egypt acknowledged publicly of doing in a mass scale with Israel, this cooperation. Before that, there was peace, there was no war, and so on. This was obvious, and the rest of things either didn't happen on the civilian level or were downplayed by the Egyptians. This thing they maintain as a major Egyptian interest, and we have gas going from Israel to Egypt, where it's liquefied and sent, and this cooperation works well for both. So this is one important way of us using this finding to strengthening our strategic position.
Hi, and thank you for being here. As a New Yorker, I want to apologize to you that you have to be here under the cloak of darkness. It is beyond understanding for me that we have to close the shades and sneak you in the back door. It's a shame, and New York and the metropolitan area should all be ashamed that we've allowed it to happen. And we did. We elected the people, we put in power, and our actions have allowed Jews to be treated as second-class citizens. Hopefully that will change, and I know that's part of your job. But is it really possible for you to do your job when the leader of your country creates problems on a weekly basis, both by his actions in the past, his current actions, and I'm very fearful of his actions in the future? I'm not talking about the conduct of the war. I have zero criticism of what you do or what Israel does on a military basis. I do wonder how a democracy, and we live in one, can elect over and over again someone that is so demeaning to so many other world leaders. We can talk about him having an ambassador come from Turkey and sit in a lower chair than he's sitting, calling our former President Obama a schwarzer. We're all very afraid, at least the people I deal with are afraid of how he's going to behave if we're lucky enough to have a woman of color elected. He has disdain for people. As an Israeli, you can't defend his actions. You have to defend the nation. I understand that. I don't mean to put you on a spot, but we all live with your problems. There are many of us who wake up in the morning and the first thing we think of is what's happening in Israel. Not what's happening in here, not what's happening with our children, but what's happening in Israel. So I wish you Godspeed. You have a very difficult task. You have the major newspapers in the world are against Israel, be it the New York Times, be it the Guardian, be it the Telegraph, be it the Associated Press, be it the Washington Post. We have to be able to combat. We have all these geniuses in Israel. We have these Nobel Prize winners. We have the second or third best tech people in the world. And yet Wikipedia was taken over by anti-Semites. The first thing that comes up when you're doing, yeah. What can you do? What can you do to combat the press and the social media with the resources you have at hand? Sorry it was so long. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, it's a major thing that we do, the media, and we deal with the media on the anti-Semitism front. But before I'll touch upon that, I'll say that I'm a civil servant. I chose to be a civil servant. I'm not a politician. If I would opt to influence politics, I'd probably be in a different career. As a civil servant, and particularly a diplomat that represents Israel abroad, I don't give grades, not to Israeli politicians and not to American politicians. This is not my business. I do my utmost to identify what's the best interest of my country and try to maximize it in the benefit of my country. I don't choose the circumstances in which I operate, but I'm aware of them. But also on a deeper level, I think all of us are citizens in democracy. We understand that democracy has its flaws, but it has also its rules. As citizens in a democracy, I'm sure all of you experience, you win some and you lose some. Were you always appeased with any congressman, senator, and governor and president that was here in the US? I've known several American diplomats throughout the years, which I had very intimate dialogue with, which were not necessarily very appreciative of this administration or other administration. But they kept serving their country because they're a civil servant. And you don't get to choose as a civil servant who runs the country. I mean, you get to choose like any other citizen when there's election, but not beyond that. So of course I have my private beliefs and opinions, and I cast my vote at the relevant day, but that stays there. And as a civil servant, I do my utmost to represent my country's best interests and represent all of my country's citizens, regardless of their political beliefs, identity, and so on. So when I'm here, I'm representing all of Israel's society, including the settlers and the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs and everyone. Yes, there are government policy lines which I will follow because I'm a civil servant. That doesn't mean that I don't get my inspiration or my guidelines from the whole of Israeli society. Just to say, when an ambassador or head of mission or consul general is being appointed, he's not appointed by the foreign minister or the prime minister. The person who signs his certificate, his appointment, is the president of Israel, which is by definition, once he becomes president, he resigns all party that he belongs to, and he's not a politician anymore. About your question, what can we do? We reaching out, including to the very critical voices that you mentioned, We have a constant dialogue. Sometimes it's more intimate, sometimes less so, with important media of all kinds. We're no stranger to the New York Times, and in Washington to the Washington Post and others. I think it's crucial to have a vibrant dialogue with media as well as with others which are critical of Israel policy. A, because me as a state, I'm accountable and I want to be accountable to what we're doing. And B, as I mentioned before, I don't think it's very important to convince those that are already convinced. And very critical sometimes, a newspaper like the New York Times addresses audience that I'm less able to reach otherwise sometimes. It's very influential. It's probably the most important newspaper around the world. So I don't have the privilege not to deal with it just because it's hard. And the same applies for other progressive or critical groups, including media that we're dealing with. And I urge you to do the same. Go out of your comfort zone when you're dealing with media or others and speak, at least try to speak to those which do not disagree with, which do not agree with you about everything. Maybe be fruitful. Well, at least I hope it'll be interesting.
Thank you, sir, for your work and for joining us today. You talked about trying to work towards a sustainable future and a sustainable solution. One of the key elements to that is having a partner who is both willing and capable of a long-term peaceful coexistence. That's an element which, since Oslo and before, has not existed, either because of willingness or capability of both. Obviously, Hamas from a terrorist perspective, and even the Palestinian Authority from an infrastructure and capabilities perspective, from graft, from other things. What is the administration doing to nurture a potential long-term capable and willing partner? And what work is being done to publicize both the obstacle that exists today and path to get there?
Whereas it is always true that each conflict has two sides, and both sides making choices that impact tremendously the outcome of the relations. I think eventually it'd probably be smart to look back at what the late Foreign Minister Abba Eban have said relating to the Palestinians, that they never missed a chance to miss a chance. And this is very regrettable because they're the neighbors. If I'll quote the person who's considered to be the national Palestinian poet, Mahmoud Darwish, said in an interview once, maybe you would like your neighbors to be Swedish or Norwegian. Maybe we would like our neighbors to be Swedish or Norwegian. Well, both of us don't get it. This is what we have. You got us, we got you. I have no illusion. We cannot make choices on behalf of our neighbors. It's theirs to make. And it's true that the Palestinian society has got to go through a major shift in the way it thinks and operates to flourish, and in order for us to have a chance to have a peaceful relations with them. Because as we all know, first of all, it's not really a democracy. I'm not speaking about Hamas, who did a coup in Gaza in 2007, when it took its yesterday partners from the Palestinian Fatah organizations and just threw them off the roof, literally threw them off the roof, just to make the point that there's a new boss in town. But even Abu Mazen, who is Israel partner in some way, and we have military cooperation with Abu Mazen's forces still, and so on. But Abu Mazen is now, I believe, in its 18th year of a 4-year term. Right? There has been no elections in the Palestinian Authority since 2006. It's very complicated internally for Palestinian society to grow and get stronger when there's no democratic due process. It's not only about election. As we all know, democracy is so much more than only free and fair election to the extent they really are. It's about solving conflicts in a peaceful manner. It's about protecting weak society. It's about equality in front of the law. It's about separation of power between the branches. And you see that in non-democratic society, it's hard for them to internalize those principles. It doesn't happen overnight. We were very, very lucky in Israel to endure a society that came out as independent with several flaws, but democratic. Not because we had democratic origins. The vast majority of people that came to Israel came either from Middle Eastern non-democratic countries or from countries with very little or no democratic tradition at all in Central and Eastern Europe. But it was the leadership of the leaders of the pre-independent Yishuv in Israel that led to the democratic principle. The fact that you don't abuse, or at least not severely abuse the power when you're governing. And it's not a coincidence that democratic societies are in the forefront of almost any field that you look at in the world. Way more people in China want to adopt the American way of life than vice versa. What can we do? First of all, we're still in a war. As tiring as it is, as exhausting it is to elaborate about this again, war is not over yet. I don't know when it will be over. Hopefully soon, but we'll see. So first of all, we're trying to win the war on the parameters that I've defined before. We're also trying to make clear, I hope we're successful, it's a bit too soon to say, to make clear to our enemies that even when they caught us on the lowest point, off guard, and were able to commit atrocities in unbelievable scope, worst day for Jewish ever since the Holocaust, as many have said, obviously. Even then, the Israeli state, but even more so the Israeli society, is strong enough. And hopefully not only will we win the war, we will come out of it stronger. I can't prove it, but that's my vision, that's my hope. So that's one thing, to show them that the way of terror not only end up in a tragic catastrophe for them, but also doesn't bring them any closer to whatever their means are or the goals are. We could offer a sustainable environment in which, if our neighbors choose to make better choices, those choices will be sustainable. This cannot happen under rule of terror, not in Lebanon and not in Gaza. So no, we're not fighting Gaza or Lebanon in order to bring a better future to those people. Maybe the outcome will serve them as well. We fight them in order to have a safe and better future for our people. But if we win over terror, and this win will be a sustainable win, maybe, just maybe, there'll be an ability for the society to plant the seeds that will mature in several decades to a different thing. It will not happen in a few years, probably not in our lifetime. But if we'll see the seeds of it happening in coming years, we could be hopeful to see a different outcome. And you see it, by the way, in other countries that had nothing directly to do with Israel. You can't impose democracy, not in Afghanistan and not in Iraq and or anywhere else. By the way, in that context, I'll say that about Iran, I'm slightly more optimistic, because they have a horrible regime, but if this regime will no longer be there, the Iranian society, the middle class, the civil society, the economic situation, the history has the means to create a society which is healthier. I'm not saying necessarily it will happen, but there's a chance. In many of our neighboring countries, we're not even theoretically there.
Yes, I'm older. I
Just
couldn't
more
give
experience.
blood today because I'm over 76 and I didn't have a doctor's note. So my question is, as I read the various news, they talk about ceasefires, and I'm not sure what the ceasefire might mean other than stop shooting for a few minutes. Almost no discussion of the word peace. Like that would try to aspire to something more long-term, changing the entire landscape of the Middle East. Like peace process. I mean, well, that's a discredited term, right? But do you see anything in your investigations, your ministry, to promote peace?
Well, first of all, the people of Israel, on the very independent chart and onwards, have been eager for peace. Right? It's fundamental in our being. Shalom, all right? You all know what it means. And for several decades, it was a dream. Then things changed a bit.